Let's start this lecture with a test. Not a real test, but nonetheless a way of demonstrating a problem. Which, if any of these 3- and 4-letter acronyms do you recognize? OICI, INR, MCIA, NRO? If I had to guess, you probably don't know any of them. And if you recognize all 4, you might not need to take this course. Here are the answers. The Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, which is part of the Department of Energy. The Bureau of Intelligence and Research in the Department of State. The Marine Corps Intelligence Activity. And the National Reconnaissance Office, which is in the Department of Defense. All are spying agencies. They're all part of what we call the intelligence community, or IC. Of course, you've heard of the big intelligence organizations, the CIA and the NSA, but they are only 2 of at least 17 standalone offices in the intelligence community. As an aside, I have to tell you how much I enjoy the concept of community to describe our intelligence agencies. It's a phrase that makes it sound like a group of friends sharing a common passion or interest, like being part of the Red Sox Nation or a community church. The term community was actually first used to describe the intelligence sector during the 1950s, when Lieutenant General Walter Beadle Smith was the director of the CIA. And the term is stuck. That is according to a history of the U.S. intelligence operations by the agency-sponsored Center for the Study of Intelligence in Washington. Now, in this lecture, I'm going to try and demystify the mysterious and explain the inexplicable. My aim is to help you get a sense of the breadth of the intelligence enterprise, how it's structured, how it functions, how it relates to the rest of government, and maybe even a little bit about why it is the way it is. By way of example, let me start with the Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence in the Department of Energy. Now, the first question you might reasonably ask is, why does the Department of Energy have a spy agency anyway? Most of what energy does involves the regulation of energy production, like coal and oil, along with the funding of research into newer energy sources, like solar and wind power. But the Department of Energy is also the home for our national laboratories, with their significant technical expertise. And it houses our experts in the construction of nuclear weapons, as well as experts in nuclear proliferation, nuclear energy, radioactive waste, and other related topics. So that's the explanation. The OICI's critical function in the intelligence community is not the collection of information, but rather its analysis. In particular, OICI is the lead component in assessing foreign nuclear weapons programs. In understanding the breadth and structure of the intelligence community, the first thing you need to know is that the IC today is very different from what it was just a few years ago. In the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 terror attacks, the nation's government leaders concluded that our intelligence apparatus had failed us. And so we made an effort to fix it. Some may see this as a bit of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, but the reorganization was, in the end, quite significant. Prior to 9/11, the many intelligence agencies, and there were fewer back then, were quasi-independent fiefdoms. The head of the CIA actually had 2 jobs. He ran the agency, and he was the Director of Central Intelligence, or DCI, with the nominal coordinating function over all the other intelligence agencies. This arrangement might have made sense early on, when the CIA was the preeminent agency in the intelligence community. But in later years, it proved to be very challenging. For one thing, it's hard for any person to do 2 jobs. For another, the DCI had very little real authority over the other components of the intelligence community. He couldn't set budgets, nor could he allocate resources or set priorities. It's an overstatement to say he was a figurehead, but it is fair to say he had less responsibility and authority than appeared from the outside. When Congress took a look at this after 9/11, they didn't like what they saw. The Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004 established the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, or ODNI. The idea was that a single coordinating structure would unify the intelligence community and manage its efforts. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence will tell you that the resulting structure is more or less a federation, intended to maximize the effectiveness of intelligence collection and dissemination among 17 member agencies, while maintaining independence of action among each. Thus, the director's role is to organize and coordinate the efforts of the various agencies to meet previously determined intelligence needs. One important limitation is worth noting. The office's budgetary authority is limited to the civilian side, the so-called National Intelligence Program. As part of the back and forth that led to the creation of the office, the Department of Defense carved out the Military Intelligence Program, which is controlled by the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. In practice, this means that large swaths of the IC, including the Defense Intelligence Agency and the NSA, are not formally within the control of the Director of National Intelligence. Another innovation of the 2004 law was to establish several national hubs responsible for developing collaborative approaches to the collection and analysis of intelligence for a specific issue. Two of them are worth mentioning by name by way of example to give you a flavor of what this means. The National Counterterrorism Center, or NCTC, doesn't actually collect any information on its own account, but is designed to serve as the central repository for making connections between all of the available pieces of information about terrorism that the intelligence community collects. If our failure before 9/11 was that we did not connect the dots, then the NCTC is in the dot connection business. Except for purely domestic terrorism, think Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing, all of the data that we collect on potential terrorist threats goes through this hub. Representatives from every agency of the government with counterterrorism responsibility, including intelligence and federal law enforcement, as well as local law enforcement from big cities like Washington, D.C. and New York, sit together there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year, collecting and sharing and analyzing information on terrorist threats. The Office of the National Counterintelligence Executive, or ONCIX, is a horse of a different color. Counterintelligence is the art of trying to find the other side's spies. During the Cold War, the people that the Soviets recruited to work here in the United States. Think Aldrich Ames, the famous CIA officer who was really working for the Russians. There are at least 3 reasons why the job of finding internal spies is best managed by a central executive organization. First, of course, it's difficult to monitor your own house. Try as it might, the NSA is better off with someone else looking over its shoulders for spies than the agency is at trying to find them inside the NSA itself. The second reason, oddly enough, points a little bit in the other direction. That is the difficult question of what to do with the internal moles once you find them. A natural instinct is to neutralize the problem, to arrest the traitor. But another possibility is to exploit the discovery by feeding false information back to your adversary. Finally, a third complication is that there's a fine line between espionage and whistleblowing. Many cases clearly fall on one side of the line or the other, But often, there's some ambiguity. A central organization like the ONCIX is better equipped to make those decisions dispassionately. So, what exactly does the intelligence community do? And how does it do it? Its job is to collect and analyze information, creating intelligence. After all, information without the insight that comes from interpreting it is not terribly valuable. It's just raw data. You will sometimes hear the phrase actionable intelligence, by which we mean information that is actually useful. So the folks in the IC will tell you that creating good intelligence is a multi-stage process, from requirements to collection, to processing, to analysis, to dissemination. To see what that means in practice, let's consider a fairly typical hypothetical problem. Let's think about the Russian leader Vladimir Putin and what he might have been intending to do in the Ukraine prior to the Russian-backed uprising in the eastern part of the country. Here's how the intelligence community might have approached the problem. First, we have to set priorities and define what targets we're interested in. The Director of National Intelligence, in consultation with the Director of CIA and the Director of NSA, would identify Putin's Ukrainian intentions as a significant strategic issue. In doing so, they'd be responding to consultations they'd also held with the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and the President's advisors on the National Security Council. Through that collaborative process, the need to understand what was in Putin's mind would have become identified. Through a similar process, we might also decide that we needed to know North Korea's intentions for its nuclear weapons. By comparison, perhaps we would be less concerned with a succession issue in the southern African nation of Zimbabwe. Not that we were unconcerned, but we might, on that question, rely on open source and diplomatic reporting rather than scarce IC resources. Once a requirement is identified, the intelligence community will begin to plan an information-gathering campaign to answer the requirement. Some collection might happen through human intelligence, what we call HumInt. Some might be through signals intelligence, or SIGINT, which is the interception of communications. And some might be acquired through image intelligence, IMGINT, such as satellite photographs of Russian troop movements, and so on. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, or NGA, is one of the newest intelligence operations with its very own acronym, GEOINT. Established in 1996, then under the name National Imagery and Mapping Agency, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency charts 160 million square miles of ocean. It keeps electronic files on 45,000 airfields worldwide. It integrates that information with other intelligence to reveal where threats might arise, what their patterns of activity are, and how those forces relate to other pieces of the picture. In short, the NGA gives us as comprehensive a picture of what is where on the globe as we can possibly create. Let's keep thinking about our Putin in the Ukraine example and examine what the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency might help. But instead of using classified sources, let's see what can be done using open source satellite imagery. After the breakaway effort in eastern Ukraine got underway, and even as Russian authorities disclaimed any direct involvement, a research institution in Washington called the Atlantic Council released an analysis based in part on the freely available internet-based services Google Earth and YouTube. They found photographs of large craters in Ukraine and videos of rocket launches on nearby Russian territory, and figured out that Russian units had fired across the border. The report also used satellite photographs, along with indiscreet social media posts by Russian soldiers, to identify the Russian military camps being built near the border. Tracking by satellite photographs, video, and other visual evidence also enabled the Atlantic Council to track what it identified as Russian rocket launchers, tanks, and so on. The bottom line was pretty clear. Russian troops and gear were operating in Ukraine territory. And if we can reach that conclusion readily using publicly available information, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency likely had even more convincing data. Of course, the information collected doesn't necessarily come in pristine form. Some images, for example, need to be processed through image-enhancing technology. Encrypted communications need to be decrypted, and the codes that protect them need to be broken. Even human intelligence needs to be interpreted or processed in some sense, to the extent that we're constantly evaluating the credibility of our spies and their capabilities. Eventually, the intelligence community gathers all the information it reasonably, and not so reasonably, can about any particular topic. Then comes what, in my view, is the most important phase of the intelligence production cycle: analysis. What exactly do Russian troop movements on the Ukrainian border portend? Is it preparation for an invasion? Or is it merely an intimidation campaign designed to cow the Ukrainian government? What does our image intelligence show us? And does it match or conflict with what we think we know from the interception of Russian communications? And how does all of this fit into the overarching economic circumstances that Russia finds itself in because of, say, the price of oil? One thing that is often lost on people outside the intelligence community is how dependent intelligence analysis is on the concatenation of small, seemingly disparate pieces of information. Sound analysis is often derived from deductive reasoning. In other words, we don't always have hard facts on which to rely. Analysts will consider alternate hypotheses or use game theory analysis, for example. Indeed, entire books are written on analytic techniques. In the end, the process might produce some findings and a scenario forecast, accompanied by a statement of the degree of confidence with which the analyst views his findings and forecast. If you want a real-world example of how far analysts will go in their theorizing, consider this. One Pentagon study several years ago examined whether Putin might have Asperger's syndrome. Asperger's syndrome is an autism spectrum disorder in which afflicted adults and children express some difficulty in their social interactions, along with a restricted range of interests and possibly repetitive behaviors. The report concluded that Putin's neurological development was significantly interrupted in infancy, and that analyses of his physical movements revealed that the Russian president carries a neurological abnormality. I'm not sure if that's right or wrong, but it gives you a sense of how detailed the intelligence sometimes is. To return to our own example, satellite imagery of Russian troops moving to the border might be combined with economic analysis of Russia's oil reserves and human intelligence from someone who recently participated in a discussion with Vladimir Putin. On important matters, such as this, the intelligence community would collect all the information available to it, and it would use a number of analysts to produce a National Intelligence Estimate, or NIE, reflecting the considered judgment of the entire community. Such judgments are not always correct, of course. The infamous conclusion that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction is an off-cited example of that kind of mistake. But we can't expect perfection in analyses of human behavior. The more interesting question is whether intelligence analysis systematically provides better answers than we would get otherwise, relying exclusively on open-source public material. And we don't know the answer because the intelligence community's successes and failures are, of course, classified. Finally, there's the issue of dissemination. sharing the assembled data and analysis tends to compromise the sources and methods by which the information was initially collected. It also gives those who read the analysis an insight into the analytic strengths and weaknesses of the authoring agency. Everybody has a blind spot. Hence, distribution of this sort of information is usually limited to a select few, ideally those who would best benefit from it. Prior to 9/11, we probably limited dissemination too much, preventing people from connecting the dots. In the aftermath of Edward Snowden's revelations about National Security Agency spying operations and Army Private First Class Bradley, now Chelsea Manning's disclosure of confidential State Department cables, some wonder whether the pendulum of dissemination did not swing too far in the other direction. And that, in summary, is the intelligence life cycle. Decision makers identify information they need to know, and the intelligence community attempts to collect the data relevant to the question and provide its best analysis of what that data forecasts. It's an imperfect science at best. It's also a never-ending cycle. Facts and circumstances change. Once you complete the analysis, you have to start over again, way back somewhere near the beginning. No description of the intelligence community would be complete without the mention of a small but significant subcategory of activity, the so-called special activities. These are covert actions conducted overseas in support of the United States' foreign policy objectives. They are considered part of the intelligence community rather than the military for two reasons. First, the IC and the military operate under different systems of authority. The intelligence community's authority is mostly spelled out in Title 50 of the U.S. Code of Law. Furthermore, it reports its activities to the two intelligence committees of Congress. Under a different set of laws and limitations, contained in Title 10 of the U.S. Code, the military reports through the Armed Services Committees of Congress. The other reason foreign covert actions typically fall under the intelligence community's umbrella relates to the nature of how the United States expects others to perceive its actions. Military actions are, at least eventually, intended to become public. By contrast, covert activities are those where the role of the United States government is not apparent or acknowledged publicly. For years, the United States publicly denied conducting drone attacks in Pakistan. The Covert Act program started as a special activity of the CIA precisely because the United States intended not to publicly, officially acknowledge what it was doing there. So just how big is the intelligence enterprise of the U.S. government? Awful big. Definitive answers are classified, but there is enough information in the public domain to get a decent sense of it. The Washington Post reviewed thousands of documents and interviewed scores of people to compile the first unclassified database of American intelligence activity in a report a few years ago that it headlined as Top Secret America. The Post identified 1,271 government organizations and 1,931 private companies as part of the intelligence community. They were in roughly 10,000 locations in the United States and were working on counterterrorism, homeland security, and intelligence. The Post also reported that at least 854,000 people were working in the intelligence community and held top secret clearances. Perhaps it would be useful to take a short detour now to talk about security classification. There are a lot of people who have secret clearances, but what exactly does it mean? Well, top secret information is defined as information whose unauthorized disclosure would cause exceptionally grave damage to the national security. Secret, by contrast, that's just plain secret, not top secret, is information that would cause only serious damage to national security. Classified information may be shared only with people who hold a commensurate classification. Thus, if you hold a secret level clearance, you would not be authorized to read top secret documents. Now, there are also a number of supplemental designations that aren't strictly speaking classifications, but which nevertheless prescribe limitations on the dissemination of classified information. The best example of these is something known as Sensitive Compartmented Information, or SCI. SCI is typically top secret information whose dissemination is limited to a compartmentalized group of individuals who are identified as having a need to know that type of information. One example is the SCI designation known as Talent Keyhole, which is abbreviated TK. Talent Keyhole refers to top secret information that is derived from overhead satellite imagery. It's particularly restricted because, of course, seeing the clarity of the pictures that our satellites take, or conversely, the lack of clarity in some pictures, gives the observer information about the capabilities and methods of American satellite surveillance. The original Talent Keyhole compartment was created for U-2 airplane surveillance back in the 1950s. Today, it covers most of the work of the NGA that we were talking about earlier. Finally, one other designation sometimes occurs, that of a Special Access Program, or SAP. Usually, the designation is a nonsensical two-word structure, such as Hazel Roof, that defines a very narrow compartment of information to which only a few people have access. So if someone ever tells you that they have access to the Granite Wind program, they're boasting that they have access to a very special compartment of information, one that you'll never be able to see. So let's circle back to the question of just how big the intelligence community is. The U.S. intelligence budget, excluding the military intelligence program, is currently in the range of $50 billion a year and rose by about 1/3 during the more than decade-long War on Terror. Of course, the budget disclosure is deficient in a number of ways. It doesn't include the military portion of our intelligence system, which, as you might surmise, is quite large. And it's just the top line of the budget. We don't know how the money is divided among the 17 intelligence agencies. We do know that it includes salaries for about 100,000 people, thousands of outside contractors, multi-billion-dollar satellite programs, aircraft, weapons, electronic sensors, intelligence analysis, spies, computers, and software. Stephen Aftergood of the Federation of American Scientists says, "It was a titanic struggle just to get the top-line budget number disclosed, and that has only been done consistently since 2007. But a real grasp of the structure and operations of the intelligence bureaucracy," he adds, "has been totally beyond public reach. This kind of material, even on a historical basis, has simply not been available." So we have this giant leviathan, or sea monster. Does it work? My answer is probably well, but not so well. One notorious example burst into public view in May 2009 when retired Navy Admiral Dennis Blair, who was then the Director of National Intelligence, and Leon Panetta, then the CIA Director, squared off over who was going to manage the intelligence from U.S. embassies abroad. At the time, Blair briefed the President each day on global intelligence matters, and ostensibly, he was Panetta's boss, as the head of the new umbrella agency overseeing federal intelligence operations. But the CIA had been the country's eyes and ears abroad, its premier intelligence spy operation, since shortly after World War II. And traditionally, someone from the CIA had always been the chief of station in each of our embassies, running the entire alphabet soup of federal intelligence entities in a particular country. Blair proposed to change that. He suggested that as the Director of National Intelligence, he should get to pick who managed intelligence from the U.S. embassies, and that he should be able to select from among all various agencies officials in each country, not just the CIA. His wider range of choices would come from the National Security Agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, military intelligence, and so on. It was a classic Washington turf battle, and Blair lost. Even though on paper he was the boss, in practice, the president sided with Panetta. And a few months later, the president accepted Blair's resignation. Panetta, of course, went on to serve as the Secretary of Defense. While competition can spur better effort, it can also, as this example illustrates, be inefficient. And that's the story of our intelligence community. Partially effective and always obscure.